Hello, everybody. My name is Ismail Ali. I'm glad to be here. I'm really glad to be here with these amazing colleagues, and I'm so glad that Joe Tafur was able to join. I'll spiel a bit, just touching on a couple of the concepts that were brought up today and yesterday, and then Joe will share a bit as the most recent, I guess you could say, successful plaintiff in a referral case for the protection of his community's religious rights. First thing, I want to just appreciate the depth of knowledge on this panel. There's really, really, truly so much, and I appreciate our moderators for keeping us in it, but we really could, and in fact have basically been talking about this all day for days. And I also appreciate that, Allison, I think that you're the only lawyer I know with a therapist voice. I know a couple of therapists with lawyer voices, and it doesn't work as well that way, so. Just for a little bit of background, so I work full-time at the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. I've been in the policy realm for quite some time. I was the director of policy for the last 4 years and technically still am. I also was recently named to be the co-interim executive director along with my colleague Betty Aldworth at MAPS. We'll see how that goes, but we're in the mix, and glad to just get to expand even further into these various complexities. But my work with the CEC, with the Church of the Eagle Condor, was actually separate from my work at MAPS. I decided on top of everything to have a tiny boutique law practice. And I met Joe in 2019, and a few years later was brought on alongside the leads. To be clear, I was essentially, I guess you could call it fifth chair. The leads, Jack Silver and Gil Carrasco, who had both gone through this process before, along with Martha Hartney and Sean McAllister, all spectacular lawyers. We needed all five of us for the case. We really needed everybody. I was mostly brought in to, I think, build the case for sincerity and also to support, I would say, some of the more complex kind of issues at the intersection of the cultural complexities of syncretization of indigenous and non-indigenous practices, as well as, I would just say, kind of translation between some of these very gnarly legal concepts and jargon that we've been engaging with members of the church. I like to joke that the other reason I was brought on is because it's kind of the inverse of Charles. So I'm on here looking like this, so we had to bring on someone like Charles looking like that, so we could actually tell the whole story of what's going on here. I just want to make a couple points.
Maybe MAPS should.
Totally. I mean, we'll see. Exactly. We'll see. I think that's a little bit of both, but. I want to start by appreciating, so I usually touched on this concept earlier of this living religion, and so much of what we saw yesterday, and I think have been talking about today, is this thing that I think about a lot, which is that culture has to adapt to survive, and you see that a lot in, I think, all the traditions that we've been working with and talking about. But while culture has to adapt to survive to the modern era, to contemporary environments, U.S. legal protections demand some sort of lineage or something that can serve as a proxy for authenticity or serving as a proxy for sincerity. And we've talked a lot over yesterday and especially today about you could say, tension of what sincerity looks like. Is it sincere because I believe it? Is it sincere because it's coming from something? And this sort of brings up for me this meta theme, which we talked about a bit again yesterday and today, which I kind of see as these two axes. Are we reaching into our history and reconnecting to an interrupted lineage that then makes us authentic because we're connected to that root? Or are we talking about a kind of contemporary engagement of a religious tradition with the zeitgeist of knowledge of what's happening? And part of what I've seen over the years, I had this line some years ago that your retreat center is not a religion, because it's very common for people to use the kind of mental health angle, which is a very important one. We have highly desperate people and real needs, to then step into this question of spirituality. And maybe Joe can speak a little bit to this, but what is the line between physical health and mental health and spiritual health? And is there really a line? And are we kind of playing a game here, like we are with the word church, like we are with the word sacrament, where we're talking about something from the frame of a definition because we have to? And I think this, to me, all boils down to this question that came up in the first panel, which is how much is the construction of religion, the protection of religion, based on the adherence to the law and the safety and the fact that we're dealing with threat of criminality at its rate. Now, the truth is, and everybody knows this here, but in general, people who work with entheogens and psychedelics don't have the same rate of enforcement as other drugs do. The reason that it's hard to put the enforcement of psychedelic law and policy and so on in the same realm as this other larger shift around the war on drugs is because you just don't have the numbers. With cannabis or meth, you have numbers. You have people who are often racialized, who've been put in very, very large numbers into the kind of system of mass incarceration. You don't necessarily have that with psychedelics, which means that it's harder to kind of make that nexus until you bring in this cultural issue with respect to indigenous people and indigenous practices. If you look at the chilling effect of the indigenous practices over time and the delegitimization of those religious or spiritual practices over time, I kind of see the initial that initial restriction, which I would say started before the United States existed as a concept, to actually have kind of started the baseline of enforcement, you could say, from this very inherent cultural lens, this inherent cultural place. So in other words, psychedelics never really had the opportunity to be enforced and criminalized the way that other drugs have, because they kind of had already been snuffed out in some ways culturally much earlier in the development of the United States in the kind of modern colonial era. So what that means is that we're in an environment where people are reclaiming these concepts that have already been kind of, are attempted to be eradicated, that are sort of being kind of pulled back into the modern era because of the desperation, because of the need of the isolation, the suicidality, and the symptoms of whatever's happening. You can describe it and define it in different ways. And put us in a position where we now have to, in order to prove and show that people who are convening and gathering for the sake of spiritual connection, which may have these secondary effects of increasing community, reducing isolation, et cetera, suddenly have to prove that the thing that they're doing is real, and is real according to a particular framework in order to get the protection from it. It's a lot of work to say that we should just be able to be in human connection with each other in relation to the earth and so on, but that is why we have to have big conferences like these with a lot of legalese to actually get to, well, what is it that we have to do, or that I have to do, or that someone has to do to prove that I or my community has the right to be protected because of our practices that don't hurt people and that do come with the risk, that do require a certain level of safety, restrictions, and so on, but that may not rise to the same level of fear that I think especially the early entheogenic practices were labeled with. And I won't go into that history, but you can look up how early entheogenic practices were described by the early colonizers, by the people who kind of were part of the construction of the modern era, and how those were treated. So there's a lot there, and I can say a little bit more, but I'll maybe pause to say, I'm curious, Joe, if you are willing to say a little bit about the kind of origin maybe of the church and whatever, based on what you've heard today and yesterday, what feels particularly relevant maybe around safety and diversion, sincerity, that kind of stuff.
All right. Thank you, Izzy. Good morning, everybody. Nice to be here at Harvard. Thank you for inviting me. I just happened to be visiting to some friends that invited me to come visit, and then it coincided. Yeah, I think the origins, just first I want to frame it, I think Matt Zorn makes some very important points, that it's like in the academic discussion or the larger, the push, the front of whatever it is that it becomes, and overcoming the war on drugs, that is coming after colonial destruction of ancestral culture, ancestral practices. My teacher, Ricardo Amaringo, Shipibo Ayahuasquero in Peru, where it's legal, where it's considered, the sacred heritage of the nation. He says, and when people talk to him as if he's a drug trafficker or a drug peddler, just how offensive that is. And he says, we did not even know what drugs were, like drug. I don't even know what that word is. We've never made a drug. We don't know how to make drugs. So you're telling me that I'm involved in that. And this is an ancestral sacred plant medicine tradition that they learned from nature, literally. That's what all the ancestral traditions teach. That's how they learned it. So it's really honoring the creation itself, the creation that I went to Easter with my mom. So, our success, of course, has to do with, first of all, acknowledging the strategic reality, So it's not like there's a lot of hobby interest people, have a hobby interest in this field. But let's say you're on this path, so-called medicine path. This is very important to you to this spiritual practice is very important to you. Sharing this spiritual practice in communities is extremely important to you. Then it's different. It's not just going to be sitting around talking about it. It's like, okay, they said that that's illegal, that's a felony, Joe, you got to go talk to the Arizona criminal attorney before we move forward on this case, so you have somebody there in case First day I go up to the guy, he's like, okay, it's 2 years, Joe, right? Immediately. Like, I need you to know that before we take a step. Okay. And so then they said, oh, the DEA exemption path, they've never given it to anyone. They've never given it to anyone. So, okay, you can go to prison, and you can go this way. You can stick your neck out over here, but they never gave it to anybody. And then they say the only two people that got it is UDV and Santo Daime, and they sued, lawsuit. That's the only viable on the religious side so far. There's all this other energy that hopefully in the monotheistic religions can come in and support, and shift the culture that is currently what it is. Yes, we want Charles Stang to be on the list when the judge is looking it over. Why? To win. We have lawyers, successful lawyers. Like, that's what we're litigating. This is a litigation. So we're really thinking strategically because our interest is, in fact, to win, and we feel that we're trying to win back our dignity, for doing something that we believe is, in Colombia, it's legal. My family's from Colombia, It's considered a respected tradition. Is there misuse? Is there abuse? Yeah, So the same is true with alcohol and everything else, that's going on. And so for us, it's like, you're telling us that our culture, our heritage, our belief system is not good enough, or it can be marginalized or treated this way or discarded, as it has for centuries and centuries. So anyways, the last little thing I want to say and around this is just, so thanks to the legal support that we had, the formation, we don't have time to get into all that right now, but some Navajo community members in Arizona who really felt that this ceremony was helping them, and they wanted to help bring this access. As Navajo, as Native American, they felt that this was wrong, that they would have to go through this other authority to allow this ancestral tradition to come into them. Right now, as we speak, one of our Navajo members is in a dieta in Peru with Shipibo Maestras to advance this the way that they, that they were hoping to do, and it's being realized. But, around all of this, I was at Easter with my Catholic mom. So we had the Navajo prayers, made a huge difference in our case. We had the right lawyers, we had strong Navajo elders praying for us, observing, respecting ceremony, respecting ritual here in these Americas. We honor that, we lean heavy on that. And so for us, yeah, we believe in it because it worked. And then I have my mom's Catholic prayers, Charles met my mom. My mom's praying for us all the time. And so I'm at Easter with my mom. I'm at Easter with my mom one morning in Arizona, and the weather's good there around Easter time. And you can go to the morning mass and see the sunrise, and then I always repeat this. And we leave, and it was I'm not really practicing the Catholic that I grew up with, but I'm familiar. I went through the sacraments. Do you know what a sacrament is? This is a sacrament. No, it's sacrament. It's like, I don't grow up Catholic. We have sacraments. We're not trying to push it on anyone else. But I went through the sacraments. So I have a familiarity with the concept. So I'm there with my mom, and we're leaving, and I'm saying, it was nice. The people are warm. It was really nice. It's outside. It was beautiful. But I said, something's missing. I don't know, Mom. Like, I can't quite, for me, something's missing for me. I'm not really gonna. And she you know what? You're right. She says, you know what? We don't honor the creation enough anymore. She says, the Indians still do that. We should do that more. So that's our message to the monotheistic religions. Honor the creation of your God. Please.